Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to review The Tender Bar. This actually was a movie that surprised me quite a bit. It was one of those where I was like, wow, this actually is a really great movie. Surprisingly, something that was just like, whoa, okay. Like, I didn't go into trailers for this. I didn't see any kind of stitch of any clip or whatever of any of this. I didn't see a picture of it anywhere. I just went onto an app and saw there. In fact, there it was. So I was like, okay, haven't seen a Ben Affleck movie in a while. Let's see what the heck this movie is. And I thought it was so interesting. We do had points where they go on and they have kind of like intelligent talk, where of course we have guys reading Dickens because we have a bar called Dickens, to where there's not only beer but there's books. Uh, we of course have stuff like Idioms and Odysseys, which are basically just poems that, of course, when Jr. is to go on to Yale and is to, of course, try to graduate Yale, uh, and go on to try to struggle to not only win a girl over, but also try to make something of his life. We have this character that we really showcase like a span of almost his entire life in one film, and we really have a lot of interesting things here. This movie, I believe, is like directed by George Clooney. I'm like, well, of course it is because there's so many interesting things in this film. Sometimes this does kind of come off as a Goodwill Hunting kind of movie, but also because there's a lot of times where you get these kind of like one-liners that's like, oh my god, that's such an interesting part of this film. Especially the one-liner where the grandpa Christopher Lloyd's character is going on and saying like hey, like don't advertise that I'm a good grandfather because then everybody's gonna want one. Like I was like, oh my god, that's so amazing. I like that kind of line there. I like that kind of delivery. But not only that, we also have, because JR doesn't really have a real legitimate, like, real father, day to day father. We kind of have Uncle Charlie that kind of steps in and is to kind of guide JR through this paths of the story. And while we do that, we start to really see why Ben Affleck was picked for this role, and why like this character was a really good uh guide to JR's character, and just a really overall like something that I was like so like happy that I went and saw. Like it was a very interesting film. If you really don't know by which that I've talked about this, what is this movie actually about here? So overall, I would say that this movie is a great film. It's a very, at least at the most, interesting piece. Some people may go through it and find this movie to be boring, and I could probably understand that. But I just was like, so, like, this movie caught my attention, and there wasn't any point where I was like, man, like, this feels like there's some downtime here. This feels like there's a point of which where I'm just like, meh, like, I could of gone without this X amount of seconds. It felt every minute of this movie was worthwhile and worth watching. Um, so I just feel it was a great piece because there's so many fascinating little crumpets or little something that you can kind of just take away from this film and just be like, wow, like that is really interesting just to think about. Like when was the Magna Carta signed in 1250? All right, just random bits of knowledge coming through this film. We have at one point where, of course, Wesley like has this amazing line where he goes on and is to mention about luck and how like everybody like through their ancestry up until now, like everybody has just survived always on luck. And he is to break down why. And so I look at that line, I look at that kind of delivery, I'm like, oh my god, like there's something right about that where everything just kind of breaks down into just simplicity of just the world might just be built on just the luck of the draw for whatever reason. And I find that to be utterly fascinating to realize that, yeah, uh, going through this film. So it seems like the IMDb doesn't have much as far as actual names for certain characters. It seems like most of the stuff is to be called The Voice, or Grandpa, or Mom, or like so and so character that has no name. Okay, sure, that helps. Uh, but yeah, like this movie, like I would say, is such a rewarding piece to watch. But some people may not feel that way. Some people, again, may not like this movie, and I can understand that. Like it may be boring to you, maybe a long stretch of a film, but I came out of this just going like I did not expect me to just go like I actually liked this film. I was expecting to get bored, and I didn't. So this movie is about a group of people who are to be forced to move back home with their grandpa, and within that kind of forced living arrangement, all of a sudden people are really to turn around and want to go on and build their own lives. And so basically, it's about a whole entire family that is to go on and need to decide to build their own lives and go on and do their own things, and hopefully after that is able to break away from grandpa's house, so to speak. uh, and while that is going on, we have the story of JR, and most of the time his uncle, or some of the time his mother and father, when his father, whenever he decides to just want to just show up in JR's life. So great film. I enjoyed it. Go out of your way to say that you've seen this film, whether it's on Amazon or some other app that I've dare in fact said or mentioned through my time here of being on any number of reviews. You could probably go through anything that is to probably not be on Netflix, and you'll probably find an app that I will tell you to go through. But I'll just say Amazon for this one. Like I think Amazon is convenient enough for people. I think a lot of people would be going through Amazon to be watching any number of things, anyways. So yeah, let's go into this. Let's go into that double five time territory. I've already talked about this movie far too much. So let's go out of our way to say it's about that time again to go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. I'm also at the kind of really just a little bit of the thing called tired. So gonna try to spell out this movie and eventually go on my way to possibly either do another one or call this a day. But anyways, so let's go into it. It's spoilers, so letting everybody know. So we go on and we have both young JR and Mom, who of course are to make a road trip to make it back home to grandfather's house, grandpa's house. So we go on, of course, have Mom, who every time she is to hear the voice in the radio, she immediately turns it off. There was one point where all of a sudden the voice was on the radio, and one of the girls had knocked one of the radios over to hopefully shut this radio off, which I thought was funny. We also have Mom, who I guess had gone through every single picture that had the voice in it, and she had cut the voice out. So it seems that JR doesn't really have much of his father in his life, even as a simple thing of like really just all he has really just hearing his voice on the radio and hoping that at some point this voice will eventually help him. But we have Uncle Charlie telling young JR, it's like, well, hey, like, don't try and speak to this voice. Like, don't try and, that's on the radio. Like, don't think that your father is inside this radio. It just, you'll be wasting your time and your energy and whatever. Because Uncle Charlie kind of helps and breaks down a number of things for JR through the journey of this movie. So we go on and we both have JR's mom and JR himself go and find Uncle Charlie at some baseball game somewhere. I guess it's, or no, wait, it's practice because they're going and saying that it's batting practice and someone is telling Uncle Charlie how to pitch, Ben Affleck's character. So we go on, and of course, we realize that Charlie is to notice that JR and his mother are to be back. And so he's like, well, hey, like, couple of the other kids are back, so it's a full house. Like, we just have like going in and out basically with this house that like we just have all these people who are to just not be able, they struggle so much so. Like we find out that both JR and his mom were unable to pay the rent for some apartment for 5 months, and so that's what just eventually forced them to be led here. So to Grandpa's house. So immediately the very first thing we see here is them eating spaghetti, and we of course have them going on and talking about like the grandfather is mentioning like, hey, if you have to go pee, like go pee somewhere else, like and so we go on and we of course have it where Uncle Charlie is giving young JR some money. And so young JR is going through the house and seeing a number of people just all in there. And so we of course have mom going and asking JR, it's like, well, how do you think you're gonna like it here? And he's like, I like people. Like, yeah, this is fine. So we go on and eventually have it where we have the voice who is to go on and call this house, and JR is to coincidentally pick up, as Uncle Charlie is to, I guess it seems like he is to be sick, but I think he's hungover because he's going on and saying, it's like, well, hey, this is what a Saturday morning looks like. Because I guess he had partied hard on a Friday. So, but yeah, so we go on, we have Uncle Charlie telling JR that it seemed like this kid was trying to play sports and practice, and he wasn't all that good at it. So, if anything, Uncle Charlie's like, well, hey, like, what other good things can you possibly be good at, kid? And he's like, reading. It's like, ooh, reading. Like, I like to read too. So, like, we're gonna go on and, like, we're gonna, like, kind of work that out because don't play sports, kid. So, we go on and so back at this phone call, we have JR going and talking to his father, who's the voice. And so we have, of course, that the voice is going and mentioning about going to a baseball game possibly. And so JR is mentioning like, hey, the voice is to like say that he wants us to go to some baseball game. Like, who are the Mets playing? And so Uncle Charlie is saying, it's like, well, the Mets are playing the Braves, so, like, tell him that. So JR is going on and saying that, like, hey, the Mets are playing the Braves, and so the voice is like, well, okay, like, I'll go and get tickets and we'll go to this game. Like, wait for me, and like, I'll pick you up by 6:30. So JR is waiting outside of his house 4:30 with his Mets cap on, and like waiting for his dad for seemingly 2 hours, and of course his father never comes, probably waiting later and later that he should actually to be waiting for, and all of a sudden his mom comes over and is like, well, hey, like, where are the two musketeers? I'm like, I thought there was three of them, but oh well, I guess there's two in this story. So really just saying that like their father will never be there, but they'll be there for one another. So we eventually have it to where the voice is to come here, and we of course have Uncle Charlie that is to consistently ask the voice one way or another about his $30 that the voice owes him. When Charlie is to, of course, have JR talk to the voice on the phone, he's like, hey, where's my $30? So when the voice is to arrive, again, we have Charlie that's like, hey, where's my $30? And the voice is like, up my butt. Like, you want to go and try to pick it out? Come on. So the voice ends up going and taking his son for just a drive along. And we have this kind of interesting line of dialogue, kind of asking, the voice is kind of asking about his mother, on if his mother blames him for anything. And we go on and have this like interesting thing that this guy drops, where he goes on and says about, you know what, your mother like would go on and want freedom, but she doesn't like how I would dispense it to her. And so like, but there's nothing that he can do about that, just the way he goes on and is to kind of deal with his mother. So we of course go on, and we have the voice, who I guess at some point was to give JR a bunch of money here, and saying like, hey, like this will kind of take care for the child support that I hadn't been paying for. Because at one point Charlie had been on this radio station and he had gotten arrested for not paying child support. And so we had the voice who was to go on and want a one, of course, some like death warrant being sent out for JR's mother, but that didn't go through. And the voice was to say he was going to kidnap his kid and all kinds of things. I guess because he was just losing his freaking mind at some point. Because the voice is kind of a drunk. Plus, we find out towards the end of this movie that evidently he is to hurt women at some point, which just makes him a piece of garbage. But like, it is what it is with this story. So we go on, and eventually we have it where JR is to need somebody to go with him to school, because there is to be this psychologist who is to go on and say that JR doesn't have an identity, because the psychologist wants to know why this kid won't tell him what JR means. And so we have Uncle Charlie, of course, going to this psychologist, and he's like, well, like, why is it that you want so badly for this kid to not have an identity? Is there some other motive that you're trying to get out of this by telling this kid that he doesn't have an identity and forcing his mother to come in here? Are you wanting to try to date his mother? Is that like, is that your scheme here? It's like, oh, I got you. I figured you out. It's like, so, like, Charlie is just so intelligent because, of course, he reads all these Dickens books and is to eventually start handing JR these books, these Dickens books. And then he goes on and has a whole entire closet full of books that he's telling JR to read. So, and so we have it to where the psychologist is so just like, oh, about this whole interaction, and so we really just have it to where nobody ever questions the whole JR thing ever again. So JR is of course at school, and they end up telling him that uh, there's to be some kind of thing where uh, every father of every kid is to be invited to have this like father son thing. And so it seems that since JR's father, of course, can't come, we have JR telling his teacher, is like, well, like, my father can't come. And she's like, well, like, is your dad dead? What's the case? And so we, of course, have JR that says, like, well, my dad's on the radio. So so the teacher is like, I'll just call your mother. So what ends up happening here is we eventually have it where JR's grandpa is to go instead of his dad. And there's this really nice moment where we, of course, have the grandpa who's getting all kind of like his hair slicked back and nice suit. And he goes out, and like his wife is to, of course, say, it's like, oh, I remember you. Because once before we had Christopher Lloyd, his grandpa, just farting away on the couch, and they go on about him farting, and we have Grandpa going on talking about how eventually JR's mom became a wife and a mom, and I guess that's what he said, that women are good for eventually just becoming a wife or a mom. And Grandpa's like, well, that's what you became, right? So, yeah, setting the bar very low, I guess. But, anyways, so we go on, and we, of course, have Grandpa going on to eventually go to this place where they're going and eating food together. And so eventually, at the end of this, we have uh, really JR who had a good time. And so, of course, we get the line where Grandpa's to say, it's like, well, hey, like, uh, don't go on and tell anybody I'm great, because then everybody will want a grandfather. So something like that. I forgot the line already. Where it's like, don't tell anyone I'm a good grandfather, or otherwise everyone's gonna want one. Sure, I think that's the line there. So we go on, and we eventually have at some point consistently JR who's hanging out at this bar, and we consistently have these guys who are paying for JR's drinks, and of course he's just having soda or root beer or whatever. Um, and so we just consistently have these guys who kind of paying uh, for the little kids' drinks, and I'm like, yeah, this is so cool. And we end up at one point having it to where like the young JR is to like pay for cigarettes for some other guy using his grandpa's money. And so Charlie is to mention to JR, it's like, well, that's grandpa's money, right? Because grandpa wanted, of course, JR to go and give this money for cigarettes. as Charlie would go on, and when JR is to call or answer the call for the guy who's actually his father, we go on and we have Charlie who wants cigarettes. So it's like, hey man, go and give me some cigarettes. So so we push on further into this movie. So eventually JR is to realize that he wants to become a writer, and so eventually JR goes on and starts writing away, I guess, on this typewriter. And so now we have the whole family starting to read what JR is to give them. And so Charlie is like, you know what? There's some people that have an it factor to them. As like Charlie used to say, it's like, you know what, the drawings, like, don't do the drawings. Like, just because we have Charlie who says that JR has an it factor, like writing is his thing. And so we go on and we, of course, have JR's mom that's telling him that she wants him to go to Harvard or Yale to become a lawyer. Eventually, eventually does get accepted by Yale. They read the acceptance letter, and he's just like, man, this is gambling. This is going to the lottery. Desperately asking these people to fund us, because really, um, JR is going to need some scholarships or some grants or some whatever to get to Yale. And so we go on and we have JR who gets accepted into Yale. It's like, oh, great. Like, good for him. So we go on and we have JR go on to Yale, where eventually he is to start to meet some like minded guys. And so we, of course, had Charlie going and telling JR to go into philosophy because there is no right answer by that. So we have this one teacher who is going and talking about Odysseys and Idiot or Idiot? Yeah, Idiots, which I guess are really just poems. And so I remember the one story that I read in high school that was to be, I think, called The Odyssey, with God, I want to say it was like God, I know I'm gonna f it up. Uh, Odysseus, something like that. When I was in high school, something about that, where it was tied to the Odyssey. It's been such a long time. Um, but yeah, but you end up getting like that kind of story, and like Beowulfs and stuff like that, kind of like these big massive stories that are to be in so much detail, and eventually you're like, whoa, like this story just has so much just crammed into like one page of a story or whatever, and you're just like, wow, I'm so fascinated by the detail of story. So we go on and we all of a sudden are to really just have JR, who is to all of a sudden see a girl named Sydney, and it seems that for one reason or another he's just like, I'm after this girl. Like, I don't know what it is about her, but I'm just really after her, and hopefully our side or our like our planets just can just align together, and we can just have some time together at some point. So really, we just have JR and Wesley spending a lot of time together, going on at some party and having both these characters. We have Wesley going on and talking about how he was to go to school and was to go and see Italy and go and watch certain movies that were to make a man out of him, or was to eventually scare him half to death, like the movie The Exorcist. So because this movie is technically done in the 80s. So, because when they graduate, they end up saying that it's during the 80s. So, this is an 80s film. no offense to whoever it was that eventually wrote this, because it doesn't really matter what time period this movie really is done. It could be a timeless film nonetheless. So we go on, we're at this party, and so all of a sudden, both JR and Sydney bump into one another, and so we of course have here where JR is going on and asking how well Sydney's idiom is going with her, and she's like, "Oh, well, it's going well. How about yourself?" And he's like, "Oh, it's going well." So all of a sudden, that just kind of like makes them just think like, "Hey, you want to just go off with me to just go somewhere?" And they're like, "Sure." So eventually, JR is to walk Sydney home, and it seems that eventually, somewhere down the road, we eventually have JR who's telling his mother that he's gonna go and see Sydney over Christmas, and so JR, of course, is going to see Sydney at Christmas, and his mother's thinking it's like, oh, this is serious. Like, do you have protection? And JR's like, come on, ma. So we go on, and we, of course, have JR who is to be with Sydney at Christmas at her house, and they, of course, are banging away where all of a sudden, like, Sydney's parents are hearing all of this. And so the very next morning, we of course have uh, Sydney's parents who are talking to Sydney, and so Sydney's saying like, "Well, yeah, it seems like they know that you're here, so like we're gonna have you meet my parents." And but we kind of have Sydney just kind of turn around and consistently saying that this might just be a fling because she's technically with somebody. And at this point, we just have it to where JR is just like, well, like, what do I have to really, like, what do I have to really just win these guys over? It seems that Sydney's already plucked a guy. Like, she's already with somebody else. This is just kind of a meaningless relationship to her. And it just continues to be that way, where every time it seems that JR is to go and get with Sydney, Sydney is all of a sudden like, well, I'm with somebody. And supposedly it gets down to him being broken up with or dumped by Sydney supposedly 9 times, but this is kind of the more important one. So we go on and we have JR going and speaking to Sydney's parents, and I guess they are to be the owners of this magazine called Dwellings. And so evidently Dwellings is another word for house, so to speak, and like very eloquent like people. So we go on and eventually we have JR that just starts running out of like things to talk about with these people, and also it really just gets to the point where really he realizes like this is going to be a short thing of conversation between them, uh, because he has nothing of real value to add to this conversation, because we have JR who mentions that there's sometime that his mom goes and is to drive by these houses wondering what people are to really do inside of them, um, because she can't live this life. To where eventually JR is to realize that he has nothing of real value to offer Sydney. And so that's the main reason why they keep breaking up all the time, because JR is not of equal or same as Sydney, so what does Sydney really need with JR here, sadly enough? So, but we have JR in that conversation with Sydney's parents by like, hey, have you ever effed in a Volvo? Because that's eventually what Sydney is to tell JR, so it's just like, all right, like, F it, like, go for broke. So, JR eventually is to graduate Yale, and I'm kind of fast tracking here because there's a lot to say, and like I don't want to say every single bit of it all. So we have it where like JR is trying to figure out what the heck he's going to do next after he graduates from Yale, after he gives his mother the Yale ring, because since both of them had graduated uh, through this college together, technically because of the Two Musketeers thing, he ends up giving her his Yale ring because like they did it together. And I was like, oh, that's a nice moment as I'm awing here. Just there's so much about this movie that it's like, oh, that's so nice. So we of course go on and we have JR here that is since he's won over his mom, I guess, for the meantime. We now have Wesley that's asking, it's like, well, hey man, like, when are you gonna win over your dad? And he's like, I don't know about that one. Um, and we have Uncle Charlie that's just like, yeah, that guy. Like, Uncle Charlie is to go on and tell this story about the one time where Charlie had that whole $30 story where Charlie is to give, of course, the voice $30 and he left and vanished. So, but yeah, so Charlie continues to give, of course, uh, JR like books from this bar. So, fortunately, we also have Charlie who becomes, or Charlie, we have JR who eventually becomes 21. And so now him and his friends, like we have Charlie who's like, yeah, you guys are going to get drunk. And he's telling them, it's like, well, hey, like you need to have one kind of alcohol because every single time that you come in here, I'm going to pour this like to you no matter like how many times you come in here and you ask for something, you're always going to get the same thing. So they end up, of course, getting I think a gin and tonic, and so they're like, okay, we'll get that then. So, and it's kind of that interesting story where the voice was to go on and ask for a Scotch neat, and nobody should ask for a Scotch neat. So, so we go on and we have Charlie who gets drunk and is telling, of course, Charlie about this person that he's reading this story from, and Charlie's like, ah, like a guy who was to prove that God exists, uh, to where he had to get concrete proof. Ah, that guy. And so Charlie is to go on and give uh, JR this book instead, just like, okay, here, just take this book. So, but yeah, so we get like we'll push on more here. So we eventually have it to where Charlie is just to think that he's going to become a novelist and that he's going to write a book, but he seems to never really do that. So he's just like, meh. So when JR is to go and finally talk to Sydney, and Sydney again is mentioning that she is with somebody because Charlie used to say like, "Can we just meet at your place?" And Sydney's just like, "Well, I'm with somebody." It's like, like, God damn. How many times do I have to keep trying with this woman? Because Charlie was to go on and say, it's like, well, this was his technically first love, and he didn't think that it was ever really going to last. But there was just something about this girl that he just kept trying and trying and trying, to the point of Charlie was to even ask him, it's like, please don't tell me that you were yelling outside her door in the or yelling outside her house in the rain. And Charlie and JR is like, no, I didn't do that. And then we cue the scene where he's outside the door. Ma, Sydney, Sydney. Yeah, that's what he did. So yeah, so we go on and we have it to where Sydney is mentioning to JR that, well, I work for the New York Times, right? And so JR is like, that makes some interesting things going on here. So JR decides to go and try to work for the New York Times, eventually trying to get some kind of reporter gig. And it seems that when they're going through, it seems like this guy does really amazing work, but it seems unfortunate that there's like some votes in place that are say that Charlie is not really become a reporter, or Charlie, why do I keep saying Charlie? JR is to not be a reporter simply because he is to just write about a lot of local bars, and he should do a lot more than that. So Charlie. JR is to walk off feeling very relieved here, just like, meh, like I guess I'll just try something else. So we just consistently have it to where we have Charlie who is mentioning to JR like all the things that he needs to do to win a woman over. Like he needs to, of course, have a job, have a car, have a place, have a this, have a that, and like that's kind of like the movie Fight Club, where we have, of course, Brad Pitt, who is to go and call his dad every so often and ask like, "Hey, Dad, what do I do now?" And it's like, I don't know, get married. And so the yearly call again, Brad ends up calling his dad up like, "Hey, Dad, what do I do now?" I don't know, have kids. so so we go on and on and on with that story, and like it's like I love Fight Club. If you've never seen the movie Fight Club, man, are you missing out. What a really great film that eventually is to just kind of make you think about things and how like you should be, or you should have more freedom instead of having to think that you need to buy you don't need to feel complete, or something like that. So, going on further into this story, so we finally have it where now JR is to want to actually confront his father and really see him, and I'm kind of fast tracking through a lot of this, but like I think it's just that time now. So we go on and we have JR meeting with his dad. And so we consistently have it to where his dad is to mention to JR that he's like, well, yeah, like I've determined that every once in a while, I'd like to have a cocktail every once in a while. Then he goes on and continue to say this for some odd reason. Yeah, I should have called you and told you that I like to have a cocktail every once in a while, but I guess I never did tell you that I like to have a cocktail every once in a while. I'm like, what the is going on? Like, this guy is just weirdly becoming this, like, broken record. Or maybe he doesn't remember that he's saying this. I don't know. Maybe he's so drunk at this point. Not quite sure. Maybe he's had too many cocktails. So, all of a sudden, both the voice and JR are to share this cocktail, but then the voice is to leave this restaurant, this establishment, to go back home, where of course now JR is to meet the voice's wife and their daughter, who I guess is putting puzzles together, and JR is helping her. Mentioning how this kid, or at some point this kid is to ask how like this kid could possibly go all over the world. And so JR is to mention, it's like, well, you have to be really good at school, and then you can kind of travel all over the world. So, kind of like the one kid Wesley was to tell him before. So, all of a sudden, we have it to where the voice is going and talking to his wife, and we just find the voice's wife, who is now down on the ground, and food is just kind of pushed all over the place. And so now we finally have it to where JR is speaking up to his father, where he wouldn't have done that before, and just calling him to shut, or just telling him to shut that up. And so the voice is kind of telling JR, it's like, well, I'm sure like you wouldn't have told me that before, desperately clinging on to my voice on the radio when you were a young kid, just trying to hear, just to hear me, just to be there for you. Like you had like depended your whole life on my voice kind of thing, and now like you want me to shut that up. So we go on and we have JR who's asking this woman for a phone so that way he of course can report his father on domestic abuse or something like that. And so we go on and of course we have JR who gets picked up by this police officer is like, hey, like, can help you get to where you need to go. So all of a sudden they end up both like talking about things, and so we have JR that's going and telling Uncle Charlie at the end of this film that he's going to go to Manhattan and he's going to eventually pick up some kind of odd job there, but he's going to go to Manhattan, I'm assuming, to eventually become that novelist that he's always ever wanted to do. Because at some point he's talking to his younger self, and his younger self is telling him, like, hey, like, when are you going to become that novelist that you said you were going to be becoming, like, when you were a younger kid? And, like, you go on and you wake up at one point 20 years later and you can tell your older self how you were going to be somebody and you've gone nowhere now and so on and so forth. I'm like, man, that is a real kind of like, there was that one Bruce Willis movie where he was to like, where he was to see his younger self, and his younger self was not the nicest guy in the world. And so we really have it to where his younger self was trying to change his older self, and like, and so on and so forth. But it was a weird, goofy movie that I don't quite remember, but I know it had Bruce Willis in it. It wasn't Looper, it was the other movie. Like, that's like a whole time traveling movie. I mean, like, there was one Bruce Willis movie where there was like this 10-year-old version of himself. So it's basically Bruce Willis has technically done that movie twice. Weirdly, oddly, strangely, absurdly. Anyways, pushing on. So we go on here, and really that's just how the movie ends, with Uncle Charlie going and giving JR the keys to his car because JR is going off to Manhattan. And so JR drives off, and the credits roll with all these kind of cool little photos and videos taken of them kind of going and driving and doing this journey. We have at one point, then also the one thing that I forgot about was Uncle Charlie was to take young JR to go bowling, and we had one point where JR's mom was to supposedly have cancer in her thyroid, but it was benign. And so we had the one girl who's going with them to play bowling, where he's like, how's your mom's cancer? And so we have Uncle Charlie that's like, what? Like, first of all, it's benign, and second of all, you for saying that. So we go on and we have the girls like, well, I didn't know. So, but they go on and they end up playing bowling, and it's kind of like the bowling ball is to be like the size of your hand. It like fits in your hand, and you kind of like bowl it. I was like, wow, that's kind of like an interesting approach to like bowling. Like immediately you would just naturally assume to have like the fingers and the and roll, like not this one. It's to actually like you have to kind of toss it like you're going into some track and field like sport to kind of knock down pins weirdly. But anyways, yeah, kind of a fascinating approach to this movie. I overall just started to really just enjoy it and marinate on it, so to speak. But yeah, it seems that we don't definitively ever have JR win over that girl. But I guess that's not the real goal of this movie. The goal is just for this kid to eventually seem to be happy, and that's all that really matters. So I think with that said, I think I've covered most of this movie. Not perfectly overall to say that there isn't a number of things that I've probably missed along the way. But I think I also covered like the main things. We at one point have JR's mom, who is to at some point in this movie get a secretary job, and it seems like things are working out for her. And so like by that time, like JR is of course like going on his own path and figuring things out. And so yeah, I think that is to mostly cover quite a bit of this film. So with that said, I think I'm fine to go out of my way to say it's about that time yet again to leave, to say goodbye, everybody. Uh, because also I don't want to stretch this out anymore, because then I'll feel like I'll have to do a double clip or some goofy thing like that. So I think I'm gonna get out of here. I liked this movie. It was so enjoyable and it was so surprising. Cause I was like, oh, this is gonna be some boring. Cause I ended up liking the one Ben Affleck movie called The Accountant. I actually liked that film. That was really enjoyable, and I was surprised that I was gonna like that movie too. But yeah. So with that said, goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.